The desert sun hit the tarmac like a sledgehammer, baking the concrete until heat waves danced in the air. Elena Martinez stepped down from the transport van, her worn flight jacket catching the light as she adjusted it with practiced ease. The olive green fabric had seen better days. Countless reissues had left it soft and faded, while the gear at her waist carried that particular look of equipment that had been used hard and maintained well. Her name tag read simply Martinez, E. No call sign, no rank insignia, no command ribbons. Just regulation letters on regulation fabric. The joint NATO training facility buzzed with controlled chaos. Pilots from different nations moved in tight clusters, their voices sharp with confidence as they tossed back energy drinks and stretched theatrically in the shade of Apache helicopters. Camera crews followed some of them, briefing tablets pinned with encrypted updates, and the air thrummed with the kind of energy that came from knowing everyone was watching. Everyone except Elena. She moved quietly toward the hangar entrance, slipping past a group of technicians reviewing checklists. At the mission board, she found her name buried on the second panel under Reserve Evaluator, Non-Flying. She nodded once, as if she'd expected nothing different, and folded her clipboard. Back over the edge. Behind her, a voice rose above the staging ramp noise. It belonged to a young pilot with perfect posture and the casual swagger of someone used to winning. His call sign patch read Talon in bold silver letters. "Hey, who's the woman with the clipboard?" Talon nudged the man beside him, tilting his head in Elena's direction. "We doing diversity photo ops now?" The man beside him barely looked up. Probably some Pentagon observer. They've been floating them through evaluations keeps. The footage inclusive. Talon laughed, raising his voice just enough. "Maybe she's evaluating our hydration habits. Or checking our smiles for the press packet." The group chuckled. None of them approached her. That wasn't necessary. They knew she heard them. That was the point. Elena didn't respond. She stepped aside and continued her quiet survey of the space, hands steady, shoulders relaxed. But she noticed something the others missed. The roster had shifted again. Her flight clearance had been pulled. A base logistics officer approached with a polite, functional nod. "You're assigned to support logistics today. Non-combat role. If you could clear the flight ring, we're staging live entries now." Elena nodded and stepped away. The officer didn't wait to see if she followed. As she crossed the tarmac, the wind lifted briefly, tugging at her collar. One of the younger technicians caught a glimpse of dark ink on her neck coordinates, tattooed in precise numbers just below her left ear. He squinted, leaning sideways for a better view. "Check it out. She's got coordinates inked under her ear. What is that? Where she lost her keys." Another voice added, "Maybe it's the location of her Instagram handle." "Ghost branding," someone else snorted. Talon didn't even look up from his tablet. Decorative clearance. Got to love it. Elena touched her collar gently, adjusting it back into place. The gesture was slow, unhurried. She didn't explain. She didn't react. She simply walked toward the rear staging zone where support personnel were sorting cables and marker cones. In the stillness between the wind and voices, she stood near a utility trailer, her eyes moving across the airfield. Not to watch the pilots, but to read the wind patterns off the northern ridge. The smoke flags at the far fence twisted slightly off axis. Low crosswind increasing, she filed it away without comment. Near the staging line, a film crew began setting up their camera track. The director pointed toward the Apaches and gave instructions about capturing vertical shots. A few operators struck poses beside the simulators, ready for their moment. Elena moved back, keeping herself out of frame. A technician glanced at her badge and pointed toward the gear bins without speaking. She stepped forward and began inspecting straps, her hands moving with quiet certainty. No one noticed that was fine. She'd learned long ago that the quieter you moved, the more people forgot you were there. And the more they forgot, the more you could see. She passed the first cable pack, adjusted a misthreaded tie, and secured a latch someone else had left loose. Across the flight zone, the first helicopter spun up for a dry run, its rotor wash kicking dust in low spirals. Elena stood up, dusted her gloves once against her thigh, and turned toward the hangar. Her name was still on the manifest crossed. Out now, but still there. The ink beneath her collar remained still. N33, 17.3. E44, 23.1. Go 6. She walked back toward the shade, no one calling after her, no one asking her name. She didn't expect them to. Not yet. Elena's quarters were Spartan by choice. A narrow cot, a bolted flight locker, one desk with a dim lamp. The only sounds were the generator's low pulse and the occasional rustle of wind against the intake filters. It was just past 4 a.m. The rest of the base slept. She sat on the cot's edge, boots unlaced, a folded chart in her lap. The paper was old, edges worn soft from handling. In the upper margin, next to a faded training range stamp, coordinates had been written in black ink. N33, 17.3. E44, 23.1. Below that, in slightly neater handwriting, Go 6. The chart had belonged to her father, Captain Miguel Martinez. Had been part of a classified helicopter program in the Eastern Desert Joint Forces, training on extreme envelope rotor techniques. No press, no medals, just skill. He'd flown under the designation Ghost 6. Not a call sign for show, but a code used in black book briefings, known only to command and a handful of instructors. When his aircraft went down during a maneuver over unstable ridge winds, there had been no tribute, just a closed file and a letter that said very little. Elena had been 16. She remembered the exact moment they gave her the box medal, gray, unadorned. Inside were 3 things: his flight manual, a graphite pencil, and a patch with Ghost 6 stitched in clean thread. She hadn't cried. She'd taken the patch, placed it beneath the chart on her desk, and turned off the light. That was the last time anyone mentioned his name to her aloud. After that, she'd trained alone. It had started before the crash, really. It brought her into cockpits when she was barely tall enough to reach the pedals, not for joyrides, but for systems checks. She'd learned engine staging before she could drive. He'd taught her to listen to torque through seat vibration, to trim pitch without chasing the line, to log wind patterns by watching dust shift across tarmac. He'd used chalk on hangar walls to diagram lift vectors and maneuver shadows, made or recreate every move from memory, then test it blindfolded on simulators. No encouragement, no praise, just trust. When she got it right, he moved on to the next lesson. By enlistment age, Elena had more simulator hours than most second-year cadets, but her name was never pushed forward. She didn't come from academy pipelines. Her father's records were sealed. She entered under general contract as a systems specialist, never flagged for command training. That changed briefly during a base consolidation. A forward pilot evaluator recognized her from a control test. She ran 2 full sim rotations and passed at 100% accuracy. She was assigned a flight track. It lasted 8 months. Then, a quiet memo came through stating that optics around instructor legacy integration had become a concern. Her clearance was downgraded, her path redirected to reserve evaluator with logistical privileges. The reason was never made explicit. She didn't protest. She signed the papers, thanked the board, and returned to the training hangar the next morning before sunrise. The tattoo had come not long after. She'd inked it herself with help from an off-grid artist who'd flown out of a mountain strip. The coordinates were precise. They marked the crash site, now overgrown, unmapped, ignored. Go 6, that's what. They'd called him when they didn't want to say his real name. She'd placed the ink just under her left ear, high on the neck. Not for display, but for memory. If it ever showed, so be it. She wasn't hiding it, but she wasn't offering it either. Taped to the inside of her locker door was a faded maneuver graph, her father's final training overlay. It showed a tactical drop hover inside a low-visibility wind corridor with a correction pattern that had never been finalized. He'd been developing it when he died. Most said the move was unflyable. The parameters were too tight, the corridor too shallow, but Elena had been studying it ever since. She'd recreated the sequence across 17 different sim platforms, adjusted for elevation, drag, angle shift, and crosswind. She'd never flown it in full, not yet, but she knew it down. To the third decimal, down to the exact angle of pitch hold required to stabilize at the end. This wasn't nostalgia. This was blueprint memory. She folded the chart carefully and placed it back in its sleeve. In the stillness, she reached into a side pouch and pulled out the patch from the metal box. She hadn't worn it in years. It had no place in her current file, but the thread was still strong, the name still legible. She wasn't trying to be remembered. She was trying to be ready. Outside, a shift bell rang. Morning rotations would begin soon. Elena stood, fastened her flight jacket collar, and rolled her shoulders once. The weight was the same, but the center of gravity was hers now. The simulation prep room reeked of ozone and industrial disinfectant. Touch screens lined the walls, each glowing with blue telemetry grids. Elena arrived early, as always, her steps quiet against the tile. She moved to the far table and laid down a slim flight graph. The pattern showed a corrected drop arc for rotor instability under wind shear. The axis pitch was marked in red pencil, her own annotations checking for margin shift. The instructor. Team entered like a wave of sound and confidence. Talon's name stood top right on the entry board, bracketed in blue. Elena's was missing entirely, not moved, just gone. The lead instructor, a broad-shouldered man with a pilot's tan, walked past her without eye contact. Then he stopped, turned back, and nodded toward her badge. You're on safety protocol observation only. Observers wait outside the ops ring. We've got press in the gallery. Elena nodded. She didn't move yet. She had notes to review. He waited a moment longer, then turned back to the group. Talon was already mid-joke, leaning against the main sim panel, aviator glasses hooked into his vest. Is she here for PR footage or just morale boost? His voice carried just far enough. We got a recruiting poster coming in later. Someone snorted. Nah, they send them in to keep our testosterone down. Safety protocols. More laughter. Elena folded her flight graph, closed her clipboard, and stepped away from the console. The temperature was rising. The sim system always ran hot in the first cycle, and someone had removed a wall fan to mount a drone camera. The heat stirred her collar slightly. A breeze from the vent shifted the edge of her flight jacket just enough to reveal the curve of ink on her neck. A younger pilot near the rear wall tilted his head. Nice branding. What is that grid coordinates to her Instagram profile? Talon grinned. No, man, it's her brand. Ghost 6 sounds edgy. Like a perfume line for veterans. Another round of laughter. No one told them to stop. Elena adjusted her collar without rush, the fabric moving softly back into place. She said nothing. A technician handed her a diagnostic tag and gestured for her to clear the floor. She moved toward the observation ring, stepping behind the line. Without protest, Talon entered the simulator, adjusting the seat without reading the overlay. I'll try to keep it boring, he announced. Don't want to overshadow the real stars in the back row. The sim began. Within 2 minutes, he was off pace. His yaw correction was late. He oversteered the corridor edge, and clipped the thermal. Pocket too early. The aircraft graphics stuttered on screen. He recovered with a dramatic overcorrection that earned nods from instructors, but quietly dropped his performance index below 79%. Elena made one notation on her clipboard, not the error, but the timing. Talon hit the final vector, came in high, then stalled the maneuver and forced a manual override on descent. The room clapped lightly anyway. A technician gave a thumbs up. The system rated it passable. Talon stepped out and pointed directly at Elena. Your note-taking is probably throwing off the sensor sync. That's why I miss Carter too. She didn't respond. Next time, just stand in the hallway. Don't want your spreadsheet's interfering with greatness. The instructor beside him chuckled. Talon, be nice. She's doing her best. More snickering. A supervisor walked past her without stopping. You can wait outside, he said. We're locking the floor for priority clearance. She nodded once, moved to the exit. The door hissed open with a burst of cooler air. Outside, the hallway was empty. Through the glass wall, she could see Talon shaking hands with the press crew, someone adjusting his collar for the camera. Another tech angled a screen to show the Carter map as if the score didn't matter. Elena stood by the observation rail, hands at her sides, clipboard against her hip. She watched the playback with steady eyes. The final corridor alignment was nearly 1 full second late, an error that would cost the crew their hover time in live terrain. No one mentioned it. She wrote it down anyway. The flight graph in her folder was folded and clean, the paper worn but precise. She hadn't shown it to anyone. She didn't need to. It wasn't for them. Inside the sim room, Talon laughed again, then glanced toward the door. Elena was already gone. The hangar operations room was nearly empty, lit only by a single halogen panel above the drafting table. Elena sat on a metal stool, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hands steady over a grid of flight maps and printed telemetry sheets. Her pencil moved slowly along a hand-drawn path she'd traced and retraced dozens of times. The inked layers showed descent velocity, wind shear tolerance, yaw pressure gradients, all built around one impossible curve. She'd laid it over her father's final flight archive. The original telemetry data, classified but incomplete, had been downloaded in fragments over the years, reconstructed from pieces nobody else bothered to preserve. It had taken her nearly a decade to understand the missing parts. The pattern he'd tried to fly wasn't a mistake. It was just unfinished. She was finishing it now. Behind her, the outer door opened without fanfare. The room's air shifted slightly. She didn't look up until she heard the pause, the kind of silence that only followed recognition. Colonel David Harrison stood just inside the threshold, one hand still on the doorframe. He didn't speak, not yet. Elena turned slightly, straightening from her work. Her jacket had slipped off one shoulder during the last hour of adjustments, exposing the edge of ink on her neck. She made no move to cover it. His gaze fixed on the tattoo, not with curiosity, but with slow, dawning calculation. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the coordinates etched beneath her ear. Where did you get those numbers? He asked. His voice wasn't loud, just clear. She didn't blink. They're a site, she said, and a name. He stopped at the table, scanning the flight maps, the notes layered in pencil and pen. Then he looked back at her face. Go 6, he said, as if testing the words against memory. You're his daughter. She nodded once. Yes, sir. The colonel leaned over the table. The lines of the overlay came into view: ridge descent, thermal, rebound, a correction line angled across a negative drag pocket. It was a maneuver few on base could even read, let alone fly. This is his pattern, he said slowly. The one he was working when it happened. It's the same terrain, she said. Same drop sequence. But I corrected the hover throttle window and widened the wind tolerance by 3 degrees. Stabilizer drift under weight is neutral now. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. It flies. He stared at the path for several long seconds, his hand resting near the corner of the chart. Then, without lifting his gaze, he asked, "You've tested it?" "Yes," Elena said. "Sim data for over a year. And I've run it manual on partial lift tracks, real terrain, real elevation, shadowed fuel load." The colonel stepped back, his shoulders rising and falling with a single breath. Then he turned toward the doorway. "Prep the aircraft," he said. A technician who had just entered the hall froze. "Sir, she flies," the colonel said. "Live clearance, now." There was no argument in his voice, no debate. Just truth, landing hard. The tech hesitated. "Sir, she's not on the board." "All right, I said prep the aircraft," the colonel repeated. He turned back to the table and looked at Elena. "Load her overlay. No assist. Full diagnostics. Give her. Wind telemetry from today and drop the pre-cleared protocols." The room had gone still. Another obsolete appeared from the hall, and someone else behind him. Voices dropped low. Orders began to pass between them in clipped tones, quiet and urgent. Elena rolled up the map with clean hands and locked the pencil inside the case. She didn't smile, didn't thank him. She simply nodded and stepped around the table toward the hangar exit. The colonel followed her with his eyes. "The Apache on Pad 3 is tuned for real correction," he said. "That's the one we buried the project with." "I know," she said. He paused. "You're flying the same drop corridor your father died in." "Yes," she said. "But I'm not flying it to honor him. I'm flying it because it works." The air outside the hangar had cooled, but not by much. The desert ridge held on to heat long after sunset. Elena stood alone beside the Apache on Pad 3, helmet under one arm, flight gloves already on. The pre-flight crew had finished their checks and backed away in a half circle, watching her with the kind of silence that suggested they weren't sure what they were looking at. Some had never seen her in a flight suit. Fewer still had known she was rated to fly at all. She zipped her collar to the top and stepped onto the loading step without hesitation. The Apache crouched slightly under her weight as she entered the cockpit. No one spoke through comms. They just listened. Inside the canopy, the controls were already live. She moved through each sequence by hand fuel gate, nav sync, rotor torque readouts. Her fingers moved with ease, not fast or flashy, just precise. The system didn't need coaxing. It responded to her touch like it had been waiting. She adjusted the seat by exactly 2 notches and reached for the shoulder straps. The buckle clicked into place with finality. Outside, the tower issued clearance. She acknowledged with a single word. No sign-offs, no banner. As the rotors began to spin, the pressure in the cockpit changed. Elena felt the shift before the aircraft lifted. Her breath settled into rhythm, 1 inhale on lift, 1 exhale on stabilizer lock. The aircraft rose smoothly from the pad, blades cutting through air with perfect separation. In the tower, every console had a telemetry feed open. The colonel stood at the back, arms crossed. The climb to altitude was uneventful. She held steady on her vertical line, then curved gently east toward the edge of the ridge. The approach corridor ahead narrowed quickly, natural rock funneling wind into unstable patterns. The same location her father had entered 15 years earlier. The same direction. The same wind signature. She didn't blink. She cut speed deliberately. Wind shear touched the left stabilizer, but she corrected without overcompensating. The nose dipped on cue, and the slope appeared below, angled and uneven with loose thermals rising in chaotic bursts. It was the kind of terrain that taught arrogance a fast lesson. But Elena didn't fly with noise. She flew with numbers. The ghost drop began at 200 meters. She marked it with a single internal count. The aircraft pitched forward into descent, blades shifting pitch as she pulled into negative drift. The draft caught the left side just as she'd calculated. She held the line, resisting the instinct to steer out of the pocket. Her father had done that just before the telemetry cut. She kept straight. At 120 meters, the thermal reverse struck. A weaker pilot would have been thrown out of rhythm. She adjusted thrust 3% and rotated the nose 4 degrees, bringing the Apache into a hover, not by force, but by balance. The rotors evened out in the crosswind like she'd planned. There was no sound in her ears, no voices. The tower had gone completely silent. She held the hover for one breath, then pushed forward again, sliding laterally with just enough lift to clear the outcropping that had ended her father's flight. The aircraft flexed. She kept it aligned. The extraction vector was short only 60 meters of window left before the canyon turned vertical. She didn't hesitate. The thrust angle was already adjusted. She engaged with no overcompensation, rising in a smooth arc that cleared the final rock point by 8 meters. She brought the Apache into open air, leveled off, and let the aircraft stabilize on a return heading. Inside the tower, no one moved. Elena keyed the final sequence and activated return clearance. Her voice was calm. One completed vector. Clear systems nominal. The colonel stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the screen. The telemetry line was flawless speed sync, drop point, recovery, altitude. All values had landed within margin. The system posted the final score, 100.0. No one clapped. No one spoke. The air was too still for performance. Elena brought the Apache back to the pad and landed without external guidance. The skids touched down like they'd never left. She powered down the rotors slowly, letting the engine ease into silence. When the canopy opened, heat came back into the cabin. She unbuckled, stepped down onto the tarmac, and removed her helmet. Her hands were steady. A few techs stood nearby, not speaking. Someone in a flight vest reached for a clipboard, then stopped. No words were exchanged. The colonel walked out onto the pad. He didn't bring a crew, just a folded paper in his hand. He looked at the Apache, then at Elena. "That's the first clean execution of that pattern in recorded history," he said. She nodded once. "I didn't clean it. I completed it." He held out the paper. Final telemetry. Full clearance signed, call sign logged. She took it without looking at the numbers. She already knew what it would say. He studied her for another second. "Your father didn't fail. He was first. You brought it home." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Behind them, the aircraft settled into stillness. Wind passed across the ridge without resistance. The board in the tower updated silently. A new name blinked onto the manifest. Ghost 7 active. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially when it involved something most people thought was impossible. By morning chow, half the flight crews had heard about the night mission. By evening, everyone knew the quiet woman with the clipboard had flown a pattern that had been buried with her father 15 years ago. Talon heard it in the mess hall, dropped his fork mid-bite. "The logistics lady? She's a pilot?" "Not just a pilot," someone corrected. "She flew the Ghost 6 maneuver." Perfect score. The room went quiet for a moment. Then the questions started, but Elena wasn't there to answer them. She was back in the hangar, filing her flight reports with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. The colonel found her there an hour later. "You know, they're calling it the Ghost 7 maneuver now," he said. She looked up from her paperwork. "It's not my maneuver. It's his. I just finished what he started. The board wants to discuss expanding the program, training other pilots." Elena closed her folder and stood. "That's not my decision to make." He watched her gather her things. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry it took so long." She paused at the doorway. It took exactly as long as it needed to. The flight pad was quiet now. The Apache sat still beneath. Fading orange light, blades gently ticking as they cooled. Heat lifted in soft waves off the tarmac. Most personnel had returned to quarters or filtered out to debrief trailers, leaving only the sound of distant air units and generator fans carrying. Across the hardpan, Elena moved slowly across the concrete, helmet in one hand, gloves in the other. The zipper on her flight jacket was half open, collar soft around her neck. Dust clung to her sleeves. Her boots left clean marks with every step, then vanished. Behind her in the shifting wind. She didn't head to the control tower. She didn't check the board. She didn't speak to anyone. Instead, she walked to the bench behind the hangar where the maintenance crew usually kept their toolkits during breaks. She sat without ceremony, pulled a small cloth from her thigh pocket, and began to wipe down the gloves. The leather was warm from use. Her hands didn't tremble. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hangar, measured and slow. She didn't look up until the colonel stopped just short of the bench. He held a small envelope in his left hand, sealed and creased. At one corner, she stood, steady and wordless. He extended the envelope without explanation. She took it and opened it slowly. Inside was a patch, faded, worn but unmistakable. The black stitching still held strong. Go 6. No symbols, no unit name, just the name. Below it sat a single clearance card with her photograph clipped into the upper corner. The text at the bottom read, "Go 7, active." "You flew it clean," the colonel said finally. Elena nodded once. It wasn't for them. He held her gaze. It was for him. She didn't smile. She folded the envelope and tucked it into her side pocket with the same quiet care she'd given every other step of the day. He didn't salute. He didn't shake her hand. He turned and walked away with the same unspoken finality with which he delivered the order to fly. She watched him go, then sat back down and finished cleaning the gloves. The light shifted. The horizon darkened. Someone in the tower reset the display. A soft mechanical click echoed faintly as the new manifest registered. Ghost 7 active. No announcement followed. No call over the comms. Just a subtle change in the system, a line where before there had been nothing. Those who noticed didn't ask. Those who understood said nothing. Elena stood again, ran her fingers down the edge of the bench, then stepped off the platform and walked toward the far end of the pad. The Apache sat behind her, motionless, dark against the night. It had flown the same path her father hadn't returned from, and now it waited, no longer haunted. She didn't look back at it. Her pace didn't change as she passed the last row of parked equipment. Wind carried faint grit across the ground, brushing past her boots, slipping under her cuffs. She walked with her head level, eyes forward, posture relaxed. No lights followed her, no cameras, no applause. The hangar behind her disappeared into shadow. Elena reached the edge of the tarmac where the painted lines broke into open gravel, then paused. She adjusted the collar of her jacket once, slid the gloves into her front pocket, and continued. Her steps were measured, her body at ease. She had not been cleared for show. She had not been asked for proof. She had been trusted to carry what no one else could, and now she would carry it forward quietly, precisely, just as it was meant to be. Elena Martinez was never loud. She never asked for recognition or fought to be seen. But she showed up every day, carrying the weight of a legacy the world had quietly buried through dismissal, silence, and doubt. She held her ground not to prove something, but because she already knew her worth. And when the moment finally came, she didn't rise to meet it. She had been ready all along. This is the story of quiet strength, of legacy honored not through words but through action. A reminder that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply arrives, calm, steady, and undeniable. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.